Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Callie Cornell with the Center for Collaborative Education. We're going to go ahead and get started. We expect a few more folks to be joining us in the next few minutes, but we'll catch them up when they get here. So first, Happy New Year. We've not seen many of you since the start of the new year, so happy 2021. Fingers crossed it's better than 2020. We're so glad that you're here to join us today for the Innovation Pathways Designing for Equity workshop. Next slide, please. Sort of a few housekeeping items to get us started. We are recording this workshop so that you and your colleagues will be able to access the audio and the video recording after today. We also want to let you know that we have closed captioning available if you'd like to use that. So in the top left-hand corner of your Zoom screen, you should see a red live button similar to the image on the screen to note that Otter is creating a live transcription or closed captioning option. If you click that small down arrow, you can open up those closed captionings in real time to see the transcript as we move through our workshop. Next slide, please. So our team is here. We have the team from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, as well as the team from the Center for Collaborative Education. With us from DESE today, Jennifer Guatkin, Carrie Occasion. Also worth noting that David Baird is here with us today as well. And then on the CCE team, we have Diana LeBeau, Laura Toda, and Rita Harvey, along with myself, Callie Cornell. And for those who are new to the network, the Innovation Pathways Network, or just new to us in this workshop series, CCE is a Boston-based organization that's mission is to partner with schools, districts, and communities to increase voice and ownership, equity, and opportunities for all that reduce systemic racism and transform schools to ensure that all students succeed. If you've been with us in the past, you might notice that this mission looks slightly different than previous. And so CCE recently revised our mission statement, particularly to focus around that reduction of systemic racism in our communities and schools. And so CCE is partnering both last year and this year with DESE to provide technical assistance to the Innovation Pathways Designee Network, both those that are existing designees as well as those who are in the active application process. And so we have a number of events. We have workshops like this one, a number of webinars. We're offering PLCs. We have program spotlights and lots of other opportunities to connect and support you throughout the year. So today, specifically, we have 3 goals for our Designing for Equity workshop. The first is really to give you the opportunity to focus in on strengths and areas of growth in creating equitable access and engagement in your pathway programs. We'll also want to give you the tools and the resources to explore a continuous improvement process that focuses specifically on equitable design. And then finally, as is always the case, we hope that you'll build connections with others across the Innovation Pathways Network, both, again, those existing designees as well as those who are in the active application process. So with those goals in mind, here's our agenda for this morning. We've got a lot to cover in a fairly short amount of time. We'll do sort of a few minutes of introductions, welcomes, sort of who's in the room with us today. We'll then spend some time doing some context setting around designing for equity. And then after that, we'll spend a bit of time sort of focusing on an equity self-assessment tool. We did send out, prior to the workshop, a tool for you to take a look at. And so we'll dive a little bit more deeply into that tool and have some conversation around that self-assessment tool. We'll also have some opportunity to get into breakout rooms to talk in small groups about specific topics around equitable access and a few other topics, which I'll talk about more in just a moment. Finally, we'll do a quick share out and closing. And then we're trying something new today. One of the things we've heard from all of you is because we're in a virtual environment, you're missing that sort of water cooler connection or informal networking that happens when you tend to be in person for these kinds of workshop events. And so after we're sort of officially done with the workshop, we'll leave this Zoom window open and our team will sort of leave into a separate room so that you all can network and talk with one another if you choose, not required, but optional networking time for you to stay on and connect with colleagues across the Innovation Pathways Network. So a quick note about breakout options. We're sharing this here so that we can sort of get a head start in getting you into the breakout rooms and make that process a little bit faster. So you don't have to make a decision right away. If you're not certain, don't worry, we'll revisit this later in the workshop. But if you know which breakout room and breakout space you'd like to move into, we'd love for you to get a head start on helping us get you into that breakout room. So our breakout room options will be group 1 will focus on student recruitment and engagement. Group 2 will focus on supporting students in accessing advanced level courses and experiences. Group number 3 will focus on student and mentors and work-based learning. And then finally, group number 4 will be sort of any topic of none of these quite feel like the right fit, or there are sort of general topics I'd like to discuss with colleagues, or I sort of don't know what I don't know and want to have a general conversation with colleagues and with CCE and DESE, and that will be sort of an open discussion. If you already know which one you'd like to do or which group you'd like to move into, we ask you to change your Zoom name by sort of clicking on the 3 little dots in your picture window and using the rename option to tell us where you'd like to be. So for example, I'll be in group number 1, the student recruitment and engagement. So put the number of the group that you'd like to be in, your name, and then your preferred pronouns. And so that way we can get a head start, and our colleague Allison, who will be creating those groups, can hopefully get everyone in the right space well in time, so we won't have a delay there. So I'll give you a moment just to do that if you know. And again, don't have to make a decision now. We'll revisit this sort of midway through the workshop after you've had a little bit of context setting if you're not quite sure where you'd like to be yet. Next slide. So we'd like to just use this time to acknowledge that we are learning virtually together, and we continue to be in a sort of COVID work from home, working remotely environment. And so we recognize that there will be interruptions and distractions and lots of things going on sort of outside of the view of the computer screen. And so just being patient with one another and sort of accepting as those distractions come and not letting it interfere with our learning overall. I also want to acknowledge that this is a particularly tough topic to do online and in a virtual space. So we were able to do this workshop last year in person. So we had the advantage of gathering around tables physically with one another. And the topic of equity really lends itself to lots of interactivity and connections. So we hope that today you can engage with us and your colleagues as much as you're able to. And so through the chat window, particularly in the breakout rooms, and please don't hesitate to ask questions along the way. We sort of have done our best to sort of replicate an in-person experience around this topic, but also recognize that being virtual sort of limits what we're able to do, and wanted to recognize and call that out ahead of time. Next slide. And I'll turn it over to Diana to move us through some connections and who's in the room.
Thank you. So first, to see who's in the room, I invite you to scroll to the top of your screen, and where it says View Options, if you click Annotate, it opens up an annotation menu for you. And if you can, that's great. If you can't, you can do this in the chat. But if you can, open up that annotation menu and pick a stamp of your choice, stamp where in Massachusetts you are joining us from today. So I just put my little stamp on North Central Middlesex County. Seeing lots of stamps go up, and really excited to see the wide area of Massachusetts that you're joining us from today. This is something that is an advantage of being online, and that is just one of those trade-offs, right? So this is a wonderful reason that we are excited to be able to do this online and have those of you joining us from somewhere deep into the Cape and all the way out in the Berkshires from northernmost Essex County and southernmost Hampton County. So really great to have you all with us today. Give you another second or two to share your stamp. And I'm actually gonna capture this screen because this is kind of neat to hold on to for the future. So thank you. All right, so I'm going to clear the drawings now, but I appreciate your sharing with us. We definitely have a lot of you joining us from the greater Boston area, but really representing all over the state, and that's wonderful. As we think about our location all over the state, I wanted to take a minute and acknowledge that we are inhabiting the land that was long stewarded by the Indigenous peoples of the area. This is something I don't claim expertise on doing. I want to own, like all of you, I'm still a learner with equity and with thinking about how best to work towards growth and learning and justice. But I found it very meaningful to think about the Indigenous peoples whose land, long held land I currently inhabit, and which we use as we do our work, like today. I'm reflective of the fact that I live on land that was once the home of the Wabanaki peoples, and which was seized from them. And I also acknowledge that Indigenous people still live and work for the continuity of their cultures throughout our state and the US today. It just feels important in a workshop about equity to acknowledge how fundamental the struggle toward justice is, that it literally starts with the ground we stand on. And I feel grateful for the traditional stewards of our space. So I invite you to be thinking about this as well. As we move on, I invite you to please introduce yourselves in the chat window with your name, your school or district, and your response to the question below, which is, what is one area of innovation pathways you'd like to focus on in terms of increasing equity? This is relevant, I hope, for those of you who are in the design as well as the implementation of innovation pathways. I'll give you a second to respond. I also want to note this doesn't have to be a breakout room you're going to jump in on. It could be something that wasn't a breakout room topic. Just thinking about an area of your work that increasing equity feels particularly salient today. Love the people who are saying just learning from others. Great. I love thinking about even the diversity of the partners you're working with. That's a fantastic and sometimes overlooked area. Support, listening to others. Thanks so much. You can continue to add that to the chat, and my colleagues will be kind of monitoring the chat while I continue, but I really appreciate learning a little bit about who's in the space today, not just where you are, but what you're thinking about. Next. So to provide some context setting for today, I'm going to share a few resources and frameworks that we use as we think about designing for equity. Next slide. So a working definition that we use for equity, and as I said, we're all perpetual learners, so we've tweaked this over time and will probably continue to do so, is that we see equity as the practice of ensuring that all schools provide a barrier-free environment, ensuring that every student, especially those whose environments and conditions are compromised by systemic and structural forces, is getting sufficient support, and I would say support toward the highest possible outcomes. In Innovation Pathways world, that's the college and career options that will open up for them. The image on the left, our partners at the Equity Institute developed this image. Many of you are probably familiar with the one with the kids looking over the fence at a baseball field as a representation of equity. We found that this one looks a little bit more in a multidimensional way at the concept, and I really like that. Thinking about equity is like finding the right pair of sneakers. It's not just having the right size. It's also about thinking about what kind of performance they could support, what style is best, what size, and what level of comfort and wear and how they fit for different people. I love that innovation pathways themselves are inherently sort of a way of thinking about different types of sneakers. And I think beginning to think about increasingly tailoring those sneakers to fit the different students that might be engaging in the pathways is a way to continually work toward equity. Next slide. So the state's high quality college and career pathways definition of equity and is really focused on equitable access in an explicit way. It's implicitly part of other things, but explicitly part of equitable access. And really looking at prioritizing students that are underrepresented in higher education enrollment and completion and or high demand industry sectors. So thinking about, I want to elevate the terms eliminating barriers, which is a huge part of working toward equity, and providing student supports. You'll see those are bolded in this definition. There's some other strategies that are really hinted at throughout this definition. So I do invite you to look at the core materials provided by DESE as a starting point and thinking about working towards greater equity, both in the design process and as a continual touch point throughout implementation. So for those of you who are in the application process, you are probably in the process of transitioning from preliminary to final criteria. Those of you who are in implementation, these final criteria are something that I know will continue to be relevant for you all. Thinking about enrollment of students as sort of representative of your overall school population, thinking about having those multiple entry points and structured transition points so that students aren't locked into a pathway or tracked into a pathway, but really have that ability to join in or leave if it's not a fit for them. And thinking about, gathering longitudinal data, doing needs assessment, having plans for communication and recruitment and outreach. All of these things are all relevant and are all places in which equity can be a strong consideration. Next slide. So another way of thinking about equity and innovation pathways is that it's not just limited to some things that are explicitly using the word equity, like equitable access. So that would also include guided academic pathways, which really are a space for thinking about how students are receiving sort of those multiple entry points. Enhanced student support that acknowledges the various identities that students carry with them and how that can mean different needs and different strengths. That college, the connection to career, which is essentially part of a pathway, is a space to be thinking about what types of opportunities students are being connected to and making sure that all students are connected in an equitable way. Effective partnerships, that's looking on both sides, not just supporting the students and engaging with mentors in the workspace, but also thinking about how those partnerships can be a space to be seeking equity as well. Not to mention the fact that looking at the broader school context for equity, which is something we'll get into in a little bit, and the growth of the faculty are all aspects and have great impact on equity in the space. In short, it has to be part of all of it if you're working toward equitable outcomes. Next slide. So we look at equity, culturally responsive practices as a means to work toward equity. So we think about this in terms of both these three aspects: access, engagement, and retention. And access, that's some of the things we've already talked about: the recruitment, the communications, participation in challenging courses. Engagement is really looking at how students are interacting with their peers, how they're interacting with the structures and the programs themselves, how they're interacting with staff and with external partners, really removing all of those barriers. And finally, retention, which requires coordinated supports, strong relationship building, strong linkages to college and career. This is also part of why pathways are meant to be broad industry sectors. We're not locking students into one career option. They don't have to choose in ninth grade whether they're pursuing college or career. The advantage of pathways, if done right, is that they open up worlds for students rather than lock them into one. Next. So there's a few other early considerations that those of you who are still in the design process, this is a great time to be thinking about these things. And those of you who are in implementation, it's definitely not too late to think about some of them as well. Some things that aren't always considered but can be really an advantage in working toward equity. would be elevating women, non-English speaking, and organizations run by Black and Indigenous and people of color, informal partnerships. It's not something people always think of, right? Sometimes at first you're looking for the lowest hanging fruit of who's willing to partner with us on this. Sometimes huge corporations can be the best partners for the industry sector, but we invite you to consider what other organizations you haven't yet thought about as potentially strong partners. Work-based learning opportunities for English learners. At a previous workshop, we had an expert English as a second language instructor share that they really work toward language matched placements for their English learners in work-based learning. Are there spaces where students could do work in that industry sector that still allows them to sometimes use their native language, their first language? Intentionally building on-ramps to pathways to attract students who may not have previously seen themselves as qualified for the pathway. Finding ways that the pathway can be accessible to people coming from multiple directions. And finally, working in advance to remove the barriers so that it doesn't have to be something done on a case-by-case basis. Next slide. So CCE's framework for equity, we call it Building for Equity, looks at 3 elements that really are interrelated. We call them critical drivers that all go hand in hand if a school is pursuing equitable student outcomes. There's personal learning for every member of the school community around that self-identity and how it intersects with systems, social systems like racism, systems like classism, and other things that impact students in the community. The process itself, the other element is the process itself can be inclusive and driven by members of the community. So this means for those of you who, I know there's many of you who feel like lone wolves in your workspace, this is really a consideration for how can others' voices be an asset to the space, and that's a challenge. It's something we can grapple with together over the course of this year as we support you. And finally, culturally responsive design principles, thinking about the actual design of the pathways, the actual design of the school writ large, the context for that, and how those can really impact equity in the space. And so those principles of culturally responsive design include the following 5: culturally proficient teachers and leaders, an inclusive school culture, student-centered academic learning, supportive resources, and an engaged community. So in a few minutes, you'll get a chance to engage with these principles and thinking about your own spaces. And there's even sort of an addendum to our tool for this that looks specifically at innovation pathways. Next slide. Our recommended design cycle, for those of you who are still in the design process for innovation pathways, includes building a vision, understanding your community, moving toward designing and planning and implementing, and progress monitoring, where many of you are joining us from today. And I would just elevate that equity is a consideration at each and every one of these. The inclusion is critical, thinking about culturally responsive practices. And I hope we'll have the chance to dig into some of these later today. We have some tools that can support you in the design cycle. So one of my colleagues might be able to share with you the link to our technical assistance website for innovation pathways that includes our toolkit. We have not only the Building for Equity self-assessment tool and the innovation pathways self-assessment supplement, but we also have part A and B criteria planning tools, reflection tools, innovation pathway self-evaluation tools, all of which fold in considerations that support equitable outcomes. And to talk a little bit more about the tool that we're elevating today, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rita.
Thank you, Diana. Good morning, everyone. So I know this was sent in advance. Jennifer has added it to the chat. So if you don't have it, you can go ahead and click there. But it's a self-assessment tool. It was originally designed for Building for Equity. And sort of as an assessment tool to think about how a school community is ready for student-centered and culturally responsive learning as part of their strategic planning. It's the tool that Jennifer has put in has been sort of redesigned for innovation pathways. So we know that many of you have not necessarily had the time. So we're going to take 5 minutes. I'm going to put 5 minutes on the clock for you to familiarize yourself with it a little bit. And as you do it, we ask that you do some of the self-assessment, but we know that this is not sufficient timing for that. So it may not feel like you can get into the depth of everything, but you should have an opportunity to sort of reflect on it and think about areas for yourself and your community. And also, as a note, this is typically done in a team setting, but because we don't necessarily, not everyone is here in a team and we don't have time for breakout rooms, we are going to ask that you do sort of an individual reflection. Does everyone have access to the document? Okay, so I'm going to put 5 minutes on the clock and you can take those moments to review the tool.
I'll step in for a moment just for clarity. I was receiving a couple of questions in the chat. There's sort of two components here. The first is a link that several of us shared out, which is to the Building for Equity tool overall, which is a general tool that CCE developed. The sort of second piece, which is a sort of one-pager, is a supplemental self-assessment, which is specific to innovation pathways. So in addition to that full tool, there's a few additional points specific to innovation pathways, and that link also was just sent out into the chat. And so both of those documents are there for you to take a look at.
Okay, that's 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask for folks to rejoin. And we're going to do a few discussion questions. So Laura has very kindly made it so that we can see each other's faces during the discussion, and we'll return to the slide deck in a few moments. But in thinking about the reflections that you've just done, I'm going to ask a few people to join into the conversation and share what stood out to you as you were reading through either the larger document, the larger self-assessment, or the supplement from Innovation Pathways. Is there anything that stood out to folks? And you can just unmute yourself. And I'm going to try, if you want to raise your hand, you can, and I'll try to make a list of folks to become really chatty. Yes, and as Diana noted, please feel free to also contribute in the chat. If that's where you feel most comfortable. Folks are quiet, so I'm going to add a second question to sort of stimulate some thinking. And we do want this to be a space where folks feel.
Oh, Rita, you're muted.
Thank you, Diane. What are some areas that you identified as growth areas as relates to the guiding principles? So what are some areas where you feel like there could be some growth for your community? And I would even add, do you think if you aren't here with any members of your community, do you think members of your school community would agree with sort of your assessment of where you are?
Hi, everyone. I'm from Boston Public Schools. I can add a really quick comment on the tools. I really like them and hope to incorporate them in our work moving forward. One of the things I appreciate and we're trying to accomplish is a shift from we're offering something to a very student-centered approach that they're participating in it and completing it. And all of the language in the tools really shows that the student outcome focus. So it's not just what we're offering, it's that the students are really enrolled, engaged, and completing the pathway. And the diversity, obviously, of the school community is represented throughout that process.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that. And I think one of the things that you brought up also, it sort of activates a question for me as well that may, if you don't necessarily have areas of growth that you've identified, because we know this was only a few minutes to look at it, were there terms or concepts that you think need further definition for you or that need to be unpacked a little more to help you dive into the tool as well?
I know one thing that stood out for me I work in Haverhill, so we are a gateway community, and I know we've spent a lot of time the past year and a half focusing on, a culturally diversified staff. And, whether that is, supports in the classroom or teachers or even volunteers that are working with our students, that, we really represent our student body so that they are more encouraged to participate and can see themselves in the careers that we're exposing them to.
Thank you, Victoria. So we have a question. What does at the margins mean? That's in the chat. And I think, so if we talk about the concept, would we prefer to define it, or would we like to does anyone have a sense of sort of what at the margins means? I do want to invite other folks in. Okay. So at the margins is sort of the concept that stems from marginalized and what it means to be those students or folks in general who aren't necessarily at the center of our society. So we would typically define that as sort of the white, heterosexual, Christian sort of identities. And so those who exist on the margin, so people of color, students with disabilities, English language learners, any of those students and folks who aren't necessarily centered in our traditional educational spaces. So thank you for that question. And please feel free to push back. Yes, thank you, David. People who experience roadblocks outside of working hard at their success. Would anybody else like to contribute to their understanding of what it means to be at the margins? And I will add that I think when we're doing this equity work, sometimes it's expected that we come with a large understanding of the concepts, but it is important that we ask these questions about what concepts and terms mean and come to some collective learning. And so please feel free to continue to add those questions even throughout the day, I would add, and even if we don't get to them at this point, making sure that we note them. Thank you, Michelle. Oh, thank you, Madeline. Perfect, design at the margins. Thank you. So I do want to make sure, I want to invite others in for this. So in terms of designing at the margins, it would still be centered at like making sure the concept, the students who are outside, you start with them in mind. And so the notion that as you start with designing at the margin and with those marginalized voices, you will include and elevate everyone in terms of designing at the margins.
I can give an example. I'm an assistant principal at Lawrence High School in the 10th grade. And so we're working a lot with our upper school as far as the kids' opportunities towards graduation and post-graduation, early college, and all sorts of things. And the reality is that not every student comes to high school with the same idea of how to get to a career that they're looking to get into. They don't have the connections. They haven't grown up with the dinner table talk, and they don't casually meet people from as wide a variety of careers as others. So when we think about getting kids into pathways classes and onto pathways, we have to think about how can we help kids understand what that means. Like, what does it mean to go from X to Y and expect Z at the outcome? So I think that's what I think about when designing at the margins. Like, what are those roadblocks that we need to make sure to put into our planning so that kids really have any clue why biomedical research is different than some of the other classes we are. Like, what's the difference between a pathway and an elective class that they might have seen in elementary school, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. And I would invoke also sort of a language. I know many people are familiar with universal design for learning. And so applying that principle, it's not necessarily about focusing on the students on the margins to the extent that they're even further marginalized, but bringing them into the center and making sure that that everyone receives the resources that are available.
I think David brought up a really good point. Students they only know what they're exposed to. And so like, I know that, I mean, we're fortunate enough that we're in our 4th year with the particular program we're calling an innovation pathway. And we now have our seniors going down to the middle schools. We designed a summer program to focus on our most at-risk community, to expose them to our 5 career programs that we have at the high school. And we just got another grant, and actually Mass Hire has been amazing. We partnered with them, so they're paying our high school interns to go to the middle and elementary schools, and we partnered with our after-school program, so these activities are running after school, and we were able to even do it remotely. But it is such a huge component. Like, that was our long-term plan right along, knowing that the only way we can really recruit all of our students is to give all of the students the opportunity and exposure to the different areas and career fields, because they can't make an educated choice if they're not even aware of what like biomedical means, for example. But if they've participated in a program, you know, in elementary and then middle school, and they've done some of the engaging activities that they would see in the classroom at the high school, you know what I mean? We're breaking down that barrier of exposure, because, you know, like, I mean, even my kids are not going to be exposed to careers and things that my husband or our family, like our immediate circle, they're only going to be able to see what and be exposed to what our immediate circle has been exposed to. And so, you know, our low-income families, and if we're trying to get people, our young people, exposed to livable wage careers to break the cycle, you know, we have to figure out a pathway, basically K through 12, to offer them those opportunities.
Absolutely. Thank you, Victoria and David, sort of in thinking about how we expose students. And one thing I will add, in addition to understanding and sort of removing barriers that may exist for students, one of the ways I think we don't necessarily often think of barriers in the first place is also elevating the strengths and skills that students already have. And so what are they bringing to the school and to the classroom and to innovation pathways that you as the educator can elevate as you move into your pathways and as you're helping them navigate the pathways. Frequently, students have many more strengths than I think we initially can see. And so elevating those as part of removing the barrier. So we have 2 minutes left, and I do want to make sure that if there are any additional thoughts or questions about the tools, that we do address them and wrap up. Are there any other thoughts or questions? Jenny, I think that you're, okay, perfect.
I just wanted to say I appreciate the tools. I wished I had more tools last year when we were doing the grant, because we were trying to figure out how to balance the idea of exposing students to advanced courses while also making it accessible to all. So this is very helpful. I also think it's, I'm actually having a steering committee meeting tomorrow on the pathway, and attending that will be some community as well as community college members. And I'm going to share this equity tool for the pathway with them. And I think that that will really help them to understand the pathway purpose better. So.
Thank you. And that's exactly what we want. We want you to take these tools and use them in other settings. We're down to 1 minute, but I want to make sure, any other final thoughts? And I see that Gloria also shared in the chat. And so sort of thinking about all of the pieces and thinking about the systemic and systematic element as our starting point. Okay, Wes, I saw you unmuted. Do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that these are phenomenal tools. And I think even thinking internally at the school level and the district level, it's a great way to be able to share what the point of an IP program is. And I know, talking with other individuals from different schools, you know, that can be an issue, explaining what's the point, why do an IP program? And this is an excellent, set of tools to help, get the message out to other people internally, to in return get more students involved from those subgroups. So just wanted to thank you for that, and we look forward to using it as a tool in the future.
Thank you. And so I'm going to wrap us up, and please continue to use this tool, reflect on it, and you can reach out to any of us from the Center for Collaborative Education if you need support with them. And so I'm going to begin to transition us to the next component, which we'll be doing our breakout groups. And so I'm going to turn it over to Laura to help get us set up for that.
You, Rita. So this is the part of our time together that you all are typically very excited about. This is our transition to breakout spaces, where you're going to have the opportunity to both learn from one another about some bright spots that are maybe happening in the spaces you're in, as well as to do a little bit of sort of problem solving, thinking about some of the challenges or barriers that you're facing and trying to create more equitable access and outcomes for students. And so we are really excited that we've had a few more people join us. I know that lots of conflicting things going on during the day. So for those of you who might have not been with us in the earlier parts of today, we want to give another chance for folks to indicate which breakout room you feel the strongest affinity for today. So the first option is a space focused on equity and student recruitment and engagement. The second is supporting students in accessing advanced course experiences. The third is supporting students and mentors in work-based learning. And the fourth space is sort of a general space for if one of the other three isn't feeling like a space that is really calling to you. There's going to be a room where there'll be more open discussion to sort of catch all for any conversations folks would like to have. If the final few of you who haven't yet indicated could do so, we invite you to navigate to the three dots in your little image on Zoom, so you could rename yourself using the format that's provided at the bottom of this screen. And I'm going to pause here for just about 30 seconds for those of you who haven't yet done so to be able to get your name indicated, which breakout space you'd like to be in. And I should mention too, I can't recall if we mentioned this at the beginning, but you are welcome to join the same space as any colleagues from your school or district. We're not going to ask you to intentionally spread yourselves out. So each individual person should go wherever they're most excited to engage in conversation with. Whether that means you stay together or you split apart is perfectly fine. And we'd also like to invite, if we have any DESE or Mass Hire or industry partners here, we absolutely invite you to be in those spaces. We encourage you to join as a listener. And so you can also rename yourself if you'd like to join into one of those spaces. If not, we're happy to keep you in the main room. All right, I'm going to advance this. If you missed this or you need any help in renaming yourself or indicating which space you'd like to be in, feel free to just send us a message in the chat, please. I want to remind everyone of community agreements that we've been using within all of our virtual Massachusetts Innovation Pathway events. These are really supportive for making sure that our time together is really meaningful. We know this year more than ever, so many things are competing for your attention. So by agreeing to these community norms, these community agreements, we can make sure that this space is really meaningful for everybody. I'll pause and just give you a moment to pass your eyes over and familiarize or refamiliarize yourself with these agreements. And finally, before we move to breakouts, just want to remind you of a couple of pieces for this space. So we ask, as you're able and willing to do so, to please unmute yourself and share your video when you come into the breakout spaces. It just really supports interaction with your peers. Another thing to mention is that there will be a technical assistance partner in each of the spaces. The breakout rooms are really your own. We will simply be there to sort of help make sure that we honor community agreements, that everyone gets a chance to contribute. And we can also provide you some resources in those spaces if that is of interest to each of the different breakout spaces. In just a minute, you'll be getting a broadcast to join the space. If you don't immediately go where you were hoping to, that's fine. You'll be staying in the main room, and my colleague Allison will be able to help move you to the breakout of your choosing. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I know our group got pulled right at that 1 second left, and it looks like most people did. And I said this in a session yesterday. That always makes me really pleased, because it's a pretty good indicator that you're having some robust conversations, that you held on to that last possible second. So we would love to take a bit of time now to hear about those conversations. And what I'd propose is that we start with taking turns, to hear a brief share out from each of the 4 rooms, and then we'll open up the conversation more broadly. At the last couple of seconds, I asked the team I was with to see if somebody was willing to share out. I don't know if all the other groups had a chance to do so, but anybody can volunteer to share from the group. So let's go right in order. So breakout room 1, which was focused on equitable student recruitment, retention, and engagement. What was the sense of your conversation together?
So Laura, I failed in my facilitating duties to let people know that we're going to do a report out. I'm so sorry we were up until the last second. And so that's not something our group discussed explicitly. So I'm going to invite anyone from our group to sort of share just a brief synopsis of our conversation and what we talked about, if anyone's willing to do that. Also chatty in our group, but not in the main group. So I'll give sort of just a few seconds. So we talked a lot about sort of that pre-marketing piece that happens at the middle school level. So how do we reach our middle school students? And then how do we keep them engaged in sort of information about each of our pathway programs while they enter into the high school and making decisions about courses? And so talked about sort of how to sort of create those gateway opportunities in middle schools through, career fairs, virtual panels, making use of regional virtual panels so that you're reaching lots of different schools for different industries, so that you can reach more than one sort of group of students in different schools. Talked about sort of use of surveys in the MyCap in the beginning of the middle school and then transitioning into high school, so that students can sort of really dig into their interest area and sort of make sense of their interests and what opportunities might be there for them in the high school. Talked about some sort of creative ways to get to students and parents. And so one of the ideas that came from a group is actually renting out billboards for in their communities, so that people sort of see the ideas around innovation pathways and can learn more about that. But really understanding how to take marketing and information. We sort of really focused on that recruitment piece, how to sort of start that so that you're not just getting students who are in the school, but how do you bring that information out into the community and out into home, so the conversations are not just happening in school in the classrooms, but are happening out in the community with parents and community members. I hope I sort of shared our conversation accurately. If there's anyone in group 1 who'd like to add something or clarify anything that I said, I welcome that.
I just want to react and say, I love that you were talking about the middle school level. We've talked about, actually later this year, we're going to have a webinar that's really intended for existing or prospective Innovation Pathways districts to invite middle school team members to come and learn about Innovation Pathways and sort of spread the wealth of knowledge about this opportunity that will await many of their students when they hit the high school. So keep on the lookout. That'll be coming this spring.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And like I said, we'll get a chance to sort of circle back whole group. So if anyone from group 1 wants to share again at the end, that's fine as well. But how about group 2 for now?
Laura, I was also.
Oh my goodness.
I know. But I will say that there was wonderful conversation, and I do want to invite folks, because they did a lot of sharing of sort of big ideas, but also ideas that were very accessible to each other. Some of them are more challenging than others to implement. But if I'm gonna say some names, and if anyone wants to take a bite, Victoria or Erin or Kristen or Valerie, if you would like to share, I would love to hear your voice in this larger space as well. And I think Michael, David also shared. So please feel free to share some of I think the wonderful ideas that were sort of shared in this space.
Yeah, I can go.
Thank you.
I certainly appreciated hearing the different perspectives and different approaches to how the schools were preparing students to access advanced coursework. I know from the one thing I had kind of put on the table is we had approached it from working with our community college to create an articulation agreement, allowing the students to then maybe take 2 years of coursework to reach the same skill competency level as, a 1 semester course at the college. So it basically gave the students more time to really grapple and become successful with the curriculum. And then I'm hoping some of our other fellow people will speak as well, because they brought some great ideas to the table.
Victoria. Others in group 2?
I was in the same group. I liked hearing Mallory talk about the work that they're doing with the MyCap. And I also appreciate at the end of the conversation, David brought up the issues around navigating your way into college, and that we, need to help students with that work a little bit more.
All right, thank you so much, group 2. And again, if you have additional time, we'll circle back for you. So I'm going to pass it to my team, and Aaron has volunteered to share for us. But before he does, we had some agreement that we felt like we had a little bit of a right to brag in the main space, because we had our own form of sort of work-based learning going on, because we have a friend here with us today who's actually undergoing some job shadowing with one of my colleagues who joined our session. So, we just felt like, we really hit it out of the park before we even started talking. But Aaron, I will invite you to share about our group's conversation.
Thanks, Laura. So I'm Aaron Smith, guys, from Low High School. And I think kind of the main thing we're talking about in our group is just how important the partnerships are with your community partnerships and the people you're getting as your mentors to work with our students, and how to cultivate those, and can almost is, one of the hardest parts of getting this grant and working and moving forward, because we were required to have them, and without them we can't do it, right? So I think one of the things that I had brought up, I'm interested to see if we can make happen, would be some kind of training the trainer or mentor training for the people who we partner with, and having some kind of an hour webinar or session for them. So one, maybe they feel supported, but also then it kind of takes the ownership off of us as the grant recipient, and kind of puts it back onto Desi, and just that it's something that's mandatory. If you're going to be a partner with us through this program, you have to go through this training or this mentoring, because again, we don't know 100% who these people are, what their ability to work with students is. Are they working from home right now, and like I am dealing with childcare stuff. So everybody has a different situation, but it would be helpful to kind of know that they've been through something, and kind of check that off, and kind of say we put them through a training, or we gave them some support, and it could be something that's available to them at any time to go back to, if they felt like they needed it. And then yeah, that was pretty much it. And just kind of, again, working with your area partners who you already maybe have good relationships with, and hearing from them and who they might also know. So kind of tapping into the people we're already using to go through their programs.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Anyone else from group 3 feel inclined to share anything?
add really quickly, just speaking to what Erin mentioned about the partners. My name is Jordan. I'm with Project Learn, and we work directly with Lowell Public Schools. So not only are we able to work hand in hand with LPS, there are other community partners, right? Because it literally takes a village or a city to get this done. So being able to work with the Boys and Girls Club or the for-profit host sites that we get to work with. Anyone who wants to be involved and is passionate about it and can help with this and the recruitment process and whatever it is, just really the value of that and making sure that you can maintain and sustain those relationships.
Thank you, Jordan. All right, how about we pass the mic to group 4, main space.
Actually, everybody knew where they wanted to be today, so we did not have anybody stay back in the main space to sort of work through murky questions. So kudos to everyone for kind of knowing what you wanted to get out of today's workshop.
That's fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to transition to the next thing I wanted to do, and I hope my technical assistant partners are okay with me taking a little bit of liberty here with this group discussion. So, you know, I was thinking as, you know, I was being a learner myself as we were going through the early parts of our workshop today before we transitioned to breakouts, and there was just so much information, and I feel like my mind is running like crazy, and so I want to give us an opportunity to try to, like, for each of us as individuals to really ground ourselves so that when we leave this space today, we have something that we feel a little bit more concrete about. So like, what's the next thing? What's one thing that I really want to focus on when I leave this workshop today? So I'm going to give everybody just about a minute or 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask you whether you want to just think about it, if you want to write down for yourself, what's the one next step that you want to take in your setting? Whether it's a conversation you want to initiate with colleagues in this work, whether you feel like you need to do some continued learning on one of the topics that came up today, what's the next thing you want to commit to yourself that you're going to do focused on innovation pathways and thinking about equity in that work? So go ahead and take a couple of minutes, and then when we come back to the group, I'll ask if just a couple of people are willing to sort of share aloud what they're thinking about as the next step for them. All right, that is our time. So I have heard that writing it down or sharing it to somebody else is one of the best ways to hold yourself accountable to something that you want to get done. So in that spirit, thank you, Jennifer, for already putting this in the chat. I would love to see if a ton of people wanted to just put in the chat what they're thinking about for their next thing. And it would be really great if we could hear a couple of people say them out loud to the group, just to get a sense of what's the granular, manageable one next thing that you want to try to accomplish in the next week or so. And you are welcome to just unmute yourself and share out an answer.
I guess I'll go. As I had mentioned, our school for recruiting, we're running workshops for middle school students, and our high school students are running them. And so for me, the next step is we just got an opportunity to partner with Mass Hire and the 21st Century Community Grant that runs the after school program to do the same thing in elementary school. So we're drinking from a fire hose and got the grant like last week, and it looks like we're going to be trying to implement it in February. So that's my next goal. But it's been really cool because the high school kids are excited about what they're learning, and so the elementary kids are really engaging in the activities. Or the middle school kids so far. We're hoping the elementary kids next.
Thank you so much for sharing, Victoria. And thank you to all of you who are posting in the chat. If you're not perusing other people's responses, I definitely encourage you to do so. We've got a lot of eager, ambitious folks.
Laura, I know you can't see the chats easily with your screen sharing. I'll share a couple of highlights I see coming up in the chat. People talking about using the tool to help them plan job shadow day activities, or to help teachers think and assess what's happening in their spaces. having a fuller team meeting and being really inclusive with teachers from the middle and high school to help build out structures of innovation pathways. So really preparing to really enhance that team component of planning, thinking about how to strengthen and more fully implement MyCap. So those are just a few things that have popped up. There's a lot of great stuff here. So definitely keep perusing the chat.
Thank you. Anyone else feel compelled to share out loud to the group? All right, well, I encourage you to keep thinking. I definitely encourage you to write your goal, your next step down, put it on a Post-it note on your laptop or something. And I definitely want to encourage you to continue to consider us as technical assistance partners here to support you in your work. And I also know that there are fruitful conversations that happen across schools and districts in your breakout conversations as well. So remember to consider your peers who are here on this workshop with us today as your colleagues to help support you as well. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Callie. Thank you all so much.
Excellent, thank you. And thanks to everybody for your engagement and participation in the breakout spaces. It sounds like everybody had some really rich conversations, so appreciate that. So we have a few upcoming reminders, closing information, and debriefing. So first, we want to remind you that all of the resources we've talked about today, as well as information about upcoming events, resources from past events, are all on our Innovation Pathways Technical Assistance website. And so I've just popped that chat or that link into the chat. So feel free to go there for information. That's where the materials from today's workshop will be. Are there, but the toolkit in particular has lots of information around design and development, implementation. It has specific resources to certain topics like work-based learning and student advisory and engaging industry partners. And so there's lots of information there. It is certainly not designed for you to use every single thing in the tool, but rather for you to customize as you need resources and materials to support your design and implementation. So please feel free to continue using that toolkit and give us feedback about what's working, what you'd like to see more of, etc. Next slide, please. We have lots of upcoming events and important dates to sort of quickly go through in the coming month or two. So at the end of January and January 27th, we have drop-in office hours, where the DESI and CCE team will be available to you to answer questions, to do some troubleshooting, talk through some problem practices, share some resources. So we'll be there sort of at your disposal that morning. So it's from 9 to 11 on that morning, and you don't need to register. The link is on the technical assistance website, whose link we just shared in the chat and is also on the bottom of the screen. So feel free on the morning of the 27th to hop right into that Zoom meeting, and we'll be there. On February 4th, we have a webinar on school level sort of information gathering and self-assessment to really understand sort of what's working, what's not, and how do you know within your program. I think this will likely be more relevant to those who are existing designees and have had their programs up and running, but also sort of if you feel ready, if you're a prospective designee and you feel ready to engage in that conversation, we invite you to register for that as well. On February 11th, if you're in the application process, Part B applications are due. I know lots of us sort of have that date on the mind already. And then at the end of the month, on February 25th, we'll have our next program spotlight in our program spotlight series. And so here we have a panel of folks from different Innovation Pathways schools. We'll talk about their staffing approaches and their staffing strategies for their Innovation Pathways programs. So a great opportunity to hear from some of your colleagues about how they're approaching and how they're making decisions about staffing pathway programs. If you are applying for a capital skills grant this year, the applications are due on March 24th. So a good date to note there. The same day, we'll also have our next workshop in the series. So we'll have a student advising and wayfinding workshop to talk a little bit more deeply about how we support students in decision-making about next steps in their academic career and then in college and career after high school. As always, we have our Innovation Pathways FAQ guide. So at that tiny URL link on your screen, we are consistently updating that FAQ as questions come in. And so that continues to be updated on a regular basis. So check there for questions that you have that might be sort of a first stop before reaching out. It might already be answered in that FAQ guide. And for any of these events, all of our upcoming events, you can register for them at that Innovation Pathways Technical Assistance website. And so a quick note, Jennifer has just shared in the chat, if you do have questions about the Capital Skills Grant, she has a DESE colleague for you to contact, and that his information is in the chat there. We, in each of our technical assistance events, have a survey, sort of an exit survey at the end. We really do take a look at each and every one of the survey results to inform decisions about our upcoming events, to make sure they are the most relevant and the best use of your time as you come to these virtual spaces. So the link has just been shared in the chat. We encourage you to open up that survey. It's just a few questions. It should take you no more than 90 seconds to complete that. So I'm actually going to put a 90 seconds on our timer here and ask you to complete that survey now before you close out. I know things get busy once the workshop ends, and so we tend to forget to complete these surveys. We say, oh, I'll go back and do it later, and unfortunately it doesn't happen. So we want to invite you to complete that survey now. So we'll give you just a few seconds before we do sort of our official closeout, and then transition to some networking time if you'd like to stay on and network with your colleagues. So again, I'll put 90 seconds on the clock and see you in just a moment. And if you're not able to complete it, that's okay. So leave that link open and please complete that before the end of today or soon. And with that, we want to thank you so much for being with us here today. If you have more questions, you want to say hello to colleagues, you want to follow up with someone from some conversations that happened in your breakout spaces, we're interested in sort of just generally chit-chatting with some of your colleagues in other Innovation Pathways schools, please stay on the line. We will sort of allow this open space for you here. Our team will go into a separate room or jump off of the Zoom call so that you can have some informal networking to chat with each other if you so choose. So stay on the line there. So thanks once again for your engagement today. We recognize that this is sort of often a tough topic to do virtually, and so really appreciate all of your participation and your engagement and your willingness to share throughout the day. Our contact information is here on the screen. If you please get in touch with any questions or follow-ups, and we hope to see you at one of our upcoming events. Thanks so much.